So what is the big five? I'm going to go over these dimensions in more detail individually, but to give you a quick introduction, okay, it's the result of decades and decades of factor analysis, okay, as factor analysis techniques improved and researchers did further reduction on Raymond Cattell's factors and also independent research, okay, using personality inventories. What emerged was that through factor analysis, 5 independent factors, okay, arose. So, for example, extraversion, okay, was one clump, okay. If you gave out a personality questionnaire and one of the items was being sociable, one of the items was being talkative, one of the items was being lively, and so on, okay, people who scored highly on one would score highly on those other similar traits, okay? So that would clump together to form a factor that was called extraversion, okay? The same was true for the other factors as well, okay? So one is agreeableness, which is about those who are high in warmth, empathy, altruism, compassion, compliance, politeness, cooperation, lacking competitiveness, okay? Again, high correlation, okay, amongst those traits. So they clump together to form a factor, okay? So it wasn't the case that anyone theorized that there were 5 factors or that these were the 5 factors, okay? They were purely the result of explorative research, okay, through factor analysis. And at first, there were some skeptics, okay, but as other researchers again and again analyzed the results of personality inventories, the same 5 factors emerged again and again, okay, over decades until there was pretty universal agreement, okay, that the 5 factors were the best model of personality. So the first one here is openness, okay, they're openness, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. You can remember them using ocean or canoe, okay? So openness, the tendency to be unconventional, so seeking out novelty, appreciating that which is different, always wanting to experience something new, to experience diversity, okay? People who are high in openness get a dopamine kick from experiencing something novel, okay? And they're curious. They're always wondering about the bigger picture, about the why behind things, okay? They want to know the deeper meaning, okay? So they're more curious, explorative, okay? So not only do they appreciate diversity, but they're also more likely to seek out diversity because they want to experience new things and they want to discuss new ideas, okay? They're open to new topics and new points of view. It correlates positively with creativity and with intelligence. The fact that it correlates quite strongly with creativity means maybe it's not too surprising as to why it then correlates with intelligence, okay? Because, you know, if we're using a pretty narrow definition of creativity, it means to come up with something that other people haven't come up with, to come up with a new idea, to come up with something that's unique, okay? And there's a level of intelligence, right, that's needed in order to come up with something that other people haven't already come up with, okay? But it's a very, very broad dimension, okay, including many characteristics, okay? The second one here, conscientiousness, okay, to be organized, to be disciplined. So those who are high in conscientiousness, they like things in order. They might be more likely to stick to a schedule, okay? They're more orderly in that they like a more tidy work environment and home environment. They're more industrious, okay, meaning they always like to be on the go. They like to be using their time productively. I told you already, it's a predictor of university success or grades. The correlations, again and again, 0.4, okay, meaning it explains 16% of the variance. Okay, there's many other factors that go into explaining grades, but conscientiousness is part of it. Probably because of the orderliness aspect, that means one's more likely to stick to a schedule, do things on time. But also the industriousness aspect means that one likes to be using their time productively, they're less likely to procrastinate. They're likely to feel some level of guilt if they don't use their time productively. Extraversion we've came across before, right? Um, this was an idea by Carl Jung, but it's also been in previous models. It was in Hans Eysenck's model of personality. So this is your tendency to be outgoing, to be more sociable, to be more lively, to be more talkative. But also, it's broader, okay, than how we looked at it in relation to Jung. Yes, it is in part about your energy, in that if you're more extroverted, you are more likely to be energized by being in social environments. But also it's associated with positivity, okay? Those who are higher in extroversion, they show more enthusiasm, they're more reward seeking, okay? Again, I'm going to go into these in more detail. Agreeableness, okay? To be trusting, to be cooperative, but also to be altruistic and compassionate, having empathy for others, to be sympathetic to others, okay? And then neuroticism, your tendency to experience negative emotion, your tendency to experience depression, anxiety, self-doubt, insecurity, shyness, but also irritability and volatility, okay? What we find is that all of these negative emotions are strongly correlated, okay? Meaning the more likely you are to experience one, the more likely you will to display the others as well, okay? Now, I'm going to go over the strengths of the Big Five model, okay? But its main strength is how replicable it is, okay? Again, it's not the case that anyone theorized that this would be the 5 factors or that there would be 5 factors, okay? It's just the case that when you analyze enough personality questionnaire items through factor analysis, these are the 5 factors that emerge, okay? You can find them in questionnaires not even designed, okay, to measure the Big Five, but based upon other personality models. You could just pick out random adjectives from the dictionary and ask people if they agree or disagree with those words describing them, okay? No matter the technique, okay, the Big Five factors, okay, can emerge through factor analysis. And it's true across cultures, okay, which is also a big source of evidence or strength, okay, for this model as well. Now, Donald Fisk in 1949 is thought to be the first one who observed the 5 factors through factor analysis. Subsequent researchers also found them, Chips and Crystal, in 8 different samples, okay, ranging from Air Force personnel to university students, okay, finding that it didn't matter, okay, what the sample was, but through factor analysis, these were the 5 factors emerging. Saussure and Goldberg are quite prominent researchers, finding the same from 1,000 participants, even when using kind of just one-word items, okay? So again, just adjectives from the dictionary, okay? Does this word describe you? Or to what extent does this word describe you? Okay? Again, the 5 factors can emerge this way. Even using inventories not designed to measure the Big Five, we can find the Big Five through factor analysis. So if we use Raymond Cattell's 16-factor questionnaire, okay, the Big Five emerge. Eysenck's theory, we're going to go on to talk about, as I say, when we talk about biological arguments. His model, though, is that there are 3 dimensions of personality: extraversion, neuroticism, and psychotism. Now, these 2 can be subsumed within the 5 factors, okay? Obviously, extraversion and extraversion, neuroticism and neuroticism. But Eysenck's psychotism factor is basically characteristics to do with low conscientiousness and low agreeableness, okay? So that factor within Eysenck's model, okay, is covered, okay, by conscientiousness and agreeableness in the Big Five. There's nothing left out, okay, from Eisenach's model by the Big Five. The Big Five is covering everything that Eisenach's model covers and more, because Eisenach's model lacks openness, okay, and the characteristics within openness. Temperament scales also, okay, can be reduced through factor analysis to find the existence of the factors. Interpersonal problems scale, even, you know, scales that might not be comprehensive enough to see evidence of all the factors, okay, like the state trait anxiety inventory, okay, that's going to load very heavily onto neuroticism, okay. Obviously, it's lacking other aspects of personality covered by the Big Five. And if you were to put together some master questionnaire, okay, that would cover items from all of these questionnaires, okay, again, all of the items would load onto one of the 5 factors, okay, from the 5-factor model. Now, Costa and McCrae were not nearly the first to discover the Big Five, but are given a lot of credit for it becoming quite so prominent because of the questionnaire that they developed. It's a questionnaire that's highly reliable in that its internal consistency is excellent. Its stability over time, even over years, is excellent. There's cross-cultural support from about 60 different countries, okay, that have all examined the Big Five. And it's shown validity as well in that the scores on this questionnaire predict actual outcomes, okay? I'll go over many examples of this, okay? But those who are higher in agreeableness and extraversion are more likely to volunteer their time, okay? Not surprising because agreeableness is associated with empathy, and extraversion also means you like being in social situations and so on, okay? But there's actual, you know, reliable, concrete outcomes that can be predicted based upon the scores on this questionnaire. Okay, so Paul Costa was born 1942 in New Hampshire. He did his PhD in human development from the University of Chicago. And it was at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, when working, that he came to meet Robert McCrae. Costa and McCrae, like I say, put together this questionnaire assessing the Big Five. And they've had over 200 articles published on the Big Five. They've co-authored numerous chapters of books and textbooks and other books on the Big Five. So they're very, very well-known researchers, okay, within the field of personality, given a lot of credit for how popular the Big Five model has become. Let me briefly describe the 5 factors in relation to the Friends, okay, because I imagine that's a TV show at least most of you have seen, okay. So what I've done here is chosen the friends that I think would score highest in each of the 5 factors, okay. So I would say that Phoebe would score highest out of the friends in openness, okay. Openness, again, is highly associated with creativity. People who are high in openness, okay, they need some sort of creative outlet, okay. For Phoebe, that's music, right? But also those who are high in openness, they, again, like to consider different ideas and to explore different ideas, but they're also very curious. And it's associated with divergent thinking, okay, meaning that they can consider multiple possibilities, okay, simultaneously. And for that reason, they can sometimes come across quite scatterbrained in some cases. Monica, obviously the one highest in conscientiousness, okay? She's incredibly orderly, right? Everything has to be in its place. She can't stand any mess or dirt, okay? Everything has to be tidy. And she's rather industrious too. She's always kind of on the go, trying to use her time productively, right? It's a good illustration of conscientiousness. Joey is, I would say, the one highest in extraversion, because yes, extraversion is associated with being quite lively and sociability, but also with reward-seeking behavior, okay? as we talk about the biological evidence for personality, I'll talk more about this, but there are differences in dopamine receptors based upon your extraversion score. Okay, those who are higher in extraversion have more dopamine receptors. So they're more reward seeking in that they want rewards more so, okay, than people who are lower than extraversion, and they enjoy those rewards once they have them more so than people who are lower in extraversion as well. Okay, so that means they're always looking for a dopamine kick. They're always looking for something that's rewarding, that's going to excite them. Okay. Rachel's probably the one highest in agreeableness, at least earlier on, right? She's less likely to stand her own ground and kind of give in to what other people want. People who are higher in agreeableness, they're very self-sacrificing, okay? They're very people-pleasing. They want to think about what will make other people happy, okay? They really orientate themselves in relation to other people, okay? If you were to ask them about themselves, they would probably begin by describing the relationships in their lives, okay? Because that's a big part of how they would define themselves, okay? And then if you've seen the episode when someone eats Ross's sandwich, it's not hard to see why he's the most neurotic, okay? But if you're high in neuroticism, yes, you're more likely to experience negative emotions, okay, like anxiety, insecurity, depression, irritability, okay, all of which is kind of by Ross. But also if you're high in neuroticism, you're in a negative mood for longer. It's harder for you to just switch out of it, okay? It's not the case that once you're in this negative mood, okay, you can then quite easily be made to feel positive, enthusiastic again, okay? It means that you're in this mood for a longer period of time. So openness is the most broad of the 5 factors, okay? So what that means is when we look at these 5 clumps, these 5 factors that emerge in factor analysis, okay, the ones that collectively make up openness are the ones less correlated, okay, in comparison to the other 4 factors, okay? It's more spread out as a factor, okay? It's more broad, okay? So it's the one that's most weakly apparent in factor analysis, and also for that reason was the last discovered of the big 5, okay? It is also so broad, it's gone by many different names over the decades, okay? It's gone by openness, openness to experience, openness/intellect, unconventional, okay? It's such a broad dimension, it's almost impossible to describe what it is with one word, okay? So that's why it's gone by many names. Hans Eysenck was loath to include it as a personality dimension because it was so associated with intelligence, and Eysenck was adamant that intelligence was completely separate from personality, okay? Again, we've seen different perspectives on that. Raymond Cattell included intelligence as a trait of personality. The big 5 doesn't include intelligence itself as a factor or as a trait, okay? But openness is correlated with intelligence, okay? But even the degree of covariation, Eysenck was of the opinion that it shouldn't be considered part of personality. So it positively correlates with intelligence, creativity, divergent thinking, novelty seeking. Again, people who are higher in openness, they want to experience something new. They want to live in a different place. They want to go traveling. They want to experience a different dish on a menu, something they've never had before, okay? It's associated with enjoying fiction, okay, in that they're more likely to daydream, they're more likely to have fantasies, they're more likely to read fiction, they're more likely to write fiction, they're more likely to enjoy art, they're more likely to have a deep interest in TV shows or movies or history or philosophy, in some abstract idea, okay? Again, people who are high in openness, they're very curious. They want to study something as deeply as they can, and they want to know the why behind things, okay, rather than just accepting things as they are, okay, on the surface level, okay? They want to know the deeper meaning behind things. Those who are high in openness, they're likely to have conversations more so about the things they're intrinsically interested in, okay? They're more likely to enjoy conversations about their favorite books or TV shows or philosophy subject or history subject rather than conversations about what they were doing at the weekend and their relationships and things that people who are higher in agreeableness, okay, might enjoy. But they typically have things that they're deeply intrinsically interested in, okay, that, again, deeply excites them. Out of personality traits, it's also the one that predicts being left-leaning or liberal, okay? Later in the course, we're going to talk broadly about the association between personality and politics or voting behavior, okay? But statistically, those who are higher in openness are more likely to be left-leaning politically. Conscientiousness is also a broad factor, but not as broad as openness. That's the broadest. And conscientiousness can really be quite neatly broken down into two sub-factors. One that's to do with being orderly and one that's to do with being industrious, okay? Those who are higher in orderliness, okay, are more likely to be tidy. They're more likely to be disgust sensitive, meaning it's more likely that they'll be disgusted by revolting smells or messes, okay? It's also true for moral transgressions in that they're more disgusted by people breaking society's rules, okay? Those who are more orderly, they're more disciplined, they're more likely to stick by the rules themselves, okay? So that might explain then why they're less forgiving when other people are breaking rules, okay? Industriousness is all about being hardworking, always on the go. The best way of looking at it is that inactivity comes with a negative feeling, okay? Because there's no positive emotion or outcome associated with high industriousness, okay? So it only really seems to be that one might be industrious because not being hardworking comes with a kind of negative emotion or guilt for not using your time productively, okay? Those who are higher in industriousness are more guilt prone, okay? Less likely to procrastinate, more likely to feel bad if they haven't used their time efficiently. Industriousness especially is a bit of a mystery, okay? There's no theoretical model. No one theorized that industriousness would be a major component of personality. There's no neuropsychological model, okay? What I mean by that is that there are parts of the brain that we can see are clearly associated with different areas of personality. I'll talk more about that when we talk about the biological perspective, okay? But neuroticism is clearly associated with the flight, fight, freeze system, the behavioral inhibition system. Extraversion is clearly associated with the dopamine system. Agreeableness is associated with various parts of the brain, like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that's associated with empathy and taking on the perspective of others and theory of mind. But there's no part of the brain, okay, that we can link to industriousness, okay? There was a 2010 paper that claimed to have found an association between the prefrontal cortex and industriousness, but every subsequent paper failed to replicate the findings, so that doesn't seem to be a clear connection. Orderliness is so clearly tied to disgust sensitivity that it's obvious to come up with evolutionary explanations for being highly orderly. If you're higher in orderliness, you want things tidy, clean, orderly, you're more likely to take precautions like cleaning your hands and so on. So you're less likely to come into contact with pathogens, and it's less likely that your food will be contaminated and so on, which from an evolutionary perspective was obviously beneficial to one's survival, right? Explaining why one would be industriousness or why one would be industrious is harder, okay? Again, because it's not associated really with any kind of positive outcome, it just seems to be the case that those who are high and industrious They just feel bad when they don't use their time efficiently. There's no psychological model really for industriousness either, meaning it's hard to really explain psychologically what it's like. You know, you ask someone who's high in anxiety to explain what it's like, and they can explain many symptoms, and they can explain the different cognitive distortions and thinking styles and the different worries and ruminations that they have, okay? If you ask someone who's high in orderliness, okay, they could talk about the fact that they're disgusted by mess and smells or anything that's kind of revolting or untidy, okay? They want to just clean a room, okay, when they see mess. If you ask someone who's high in industriousness to explain why they're so industrious, you're probably going to get some kind of vague answer like, well, I just don't like sitting still, or I like to be motivated, or I like to be on the go. Actually explaining deeply what it actually feels like to be highly industrious is actually very difficult. We don't have a clear psychological model of it. And there's no pharmacological model either, meaning we cannot make people more industrious than they are, okay? The closest thing would be ADHD medication that can make one more focused on a task, okay? But that's not the same as being industrious. That's all about wanting to use your time as efficiently as you can and stay persistently motivated. Maybe the most interesting thing here about industriousness is we cannot measure it with any task, okay? We can only measure it with questionnaires. There's been many, many attempts to measure it with a task, an experiment, okay, all unsuccessful. You can easily measure orderliness with a questionnaire, or you can measure it with a task. Okay, you see how disgusted one is by a revolting sight, a picture, a video, a smell, whatever. Okay, it's easy to come up with a task that measures anxiety. Okay, you look for signs of anxiety in a stressful situation. But there hasn't been any successful attempt to come up with a task that measures how industrious one is, okay? The problem is that researchers who do so end up accidentally measuring intelligence instead, okay? Because you might think, I want to see how industrious one is by a task. I'll give them all very difficult problems to solve, and those who stick with it will be the ones who are more industrious. But actually, those who are more intelligent are going to solve the problem more easily, okay? And so that's a difficult thing to navigate around, okay? Conscientiousness, it's positively associated, like I say, with school performance, exams. It's one of the best predictors of success in the military. It's also associated with happiness. Okay, those who are higher in conscientiousness, they're more likely to have a wide range of outcomes, actually. They're more likely to be physically healthier, they're more likely to diet, they're more likely to exercise, they're more likely to look after themselves, they're more likely to be happy and be more satisfied with their life as well. It's again associated with feelings of disgust. This involves physical disgust for sights and smells, but also for moral transgressions, okay? Those who are on a jury, if you're on a jury and you're asked to consider the facts of a case and decide if a defendant is guilty or innocent, or guilty or not guilty, rather, someone who's higher in conscientiousness might be more likely to scrutinize the evidence more carefully, but if they are convinced that the defendant is guilty, they're more likely to demand a harsher punishment than those who are lower in conscientiousness. They're more likely to be in favor of the death penalty when the person is certainly guilty, okay, than someone who is lower in conscientiousness. Again, they're less likely to break the rules themselves, so maybe that's why they're more likely to be less forgiving when other people break them. Again, associated with guilt if you don't use your time productively, and it's associated with conservatism, okay? And again, politics, okay? They're more likely to be right-leaning and politically conservative. Again, if you're higher in conscientiousness, you might be more likely to stick to that which has been shown to be successful, okay? But what I should say is that openness is the better predictor, okay? Low openness predicts conservatism better than high conscientiousness, okay? So if someone was both highly open and highly conscientious, then statistically they'd be more likely to be liberal than conservative. It's negatively correlated with negative emotions. If you're more conscientious, you're more kind of in control of your life and environment. So that might mean that you're less likely to come into situations that would cause you anxiety or depression. It's negatively associated with adultery or risky sexual behavior. Okay, those who are higher in conscientiousness, they're less likely to have affairs. They're less likely to do a number of reckless behaviors, okay, that include binge drinking, taking drugs, risky sexual behaviors. They're less likely to tell sexual jokes or find sexual jokes funny. They're less likely to talk about sex with their friends. They're less likely to curse. There's a wide range of different behaviors, okay, found in those who are higher in conscientiousness, okay. Okay, next up, extraversion, which again, we've talked about already in relation to Carl Jung's theory. But remember, Carl Jung was looking at it in quite a narrow way, okay? For him, it was all about, are you getting energized through internal activities or through external activities, right? We know that some of Jung's observations were wrong, okay? He thought that those who were more introverted would be more likely to enjoy reading and fiction and so on. Actually, those things are associated with openness, okay? Yes, if you're highly introverted, it's going to be more likely you find solitary activities, okay, that you come to enjoy, okay? But actually, there are many individuals who are low in extraversion and low in openness who don't enjoy reading fiction and other kind of similar activities like art and so on, okay? It's broader, therefore, okay, than how Jung defined it, okay? It's also about enthusiasm and being assertive in social situations, okay? So again, those who are higher in extraversion are more likely to take charge in social situations. They're more likely to display positive emotion, more likely to be enthusiastic, again, because it's associated with dopamine receptors and reward-seeking behavior. They're more likely to be seeking rewards. They're more likely to enjoy rewards once they have those rewards. It's correlated with happiness, higher number of sexual partners, having children at an earlier age, speaking aloud your thoughts, okay, thinking things out loud, okay, rather than internally. A higher number of friends, greater time dedicated to socializing. Again, not surprising if that's something that's motivating you. If you're highly extroverted, you're motivated by seeking out social opportunities, right? Because that's part of how you're energized. Agreeableness can also quite neatly be split into two clear aspects. One aspect that's to do with being polite and cooperative, okay, not wanting to be offensive, not wanting to upset others, wanting to kind of maintain harmony, okay, within the group. And then the other is compassion, okay, having empathy for others, being sympathetic, being altruistic, being compassionate, okay. Now, agreeableness is the one with the clearest sex difference, okay? It's not an overwhelming difference. It's a difference of half a standard deviation. So what that means is if I was to select an average man and an average woman, and I was to give them both a personality questionnaire, and I was to bet money on the woman scoring higher in agreeableness, I would be right 60% of the time and wrong 40% of the time, okay? So it's not an overwhelming difference, but it's a difference that's reliable, okay? In that women, on average, score higher in agreeableness than men do, okay? As well as separate related measurements, like measurements of empathy, measurements of compassion, okay, that are separately measuring particular traits, okay, rather than agreeableness more broadly. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question. So the question was, has this sex difference in agreeableness got smaller over the years, right? Okay. Um, the answer is no. Okay, there is not an apparent difference based upon time, and in fact, I'm going to talk about this a bit later. Okay, but when we look at different countries, okay, and we look at countries in which when men and women are more equal versus countries where men and women are less equal, it's been predicted, unsurprisingly, that in countries where men and women are more equal, the sex difference will be smaller. Okay, the opposite has always been found. Okay, in countries where men and women are more equal, that are more egalitarian, okay, the sex difference is actually larger than in countries like in Eastern Asia, where men and women are treated less equal. Okay, I'm going to come back to what that means. Okay, because that's not what psychologists predicted. Okay, when doing that sort of research. So, like I say, for people who are high in agreeableness, they're very self-sacrificing. Okay, they are wanting to put others before themselves. And so if you ask them to describe themselves, they might discuss their relationships. They're motivated by the people they care about. Okay, that's what's driving them. Okay, to see the people that they love and care for be happy and be successful. Okay, it's out of the personality traits the best predictor of lower income. Okay, people who are higher in agreeableness earn less money. Okay, and that's even when controlling for the potential confound of sex. Okay, even if you were just to look at men separately, okay, men who were higher in agreeableness would earn less than men who were lower in agreeableness. Women, just separately, who were higher in agreeableness would earn less money than those who are lower in agreeableness. It could be because those who are higher in agreeableness are less likely to ask for a pay rise because they don't enjoy any sort of confrontation or asking for things, anything that could make them quite uncomfortable if they feel as though they're making the other person uncomfortable. It could also be that they're less competent in negotiations, okay? Because again, they're more avoidant of conflict, okay? They're more people pleasing. They may also be more likely to be self-sacrificing in a way that might kind of be to their detriment, okay, in terms of their income. Now, low agreeableness on the low end is one of the best predictors of antisocial behaviors, meaning criminal behaviors, okay, behaviors that violate the rights of others. It's a predictor of antisocial personality disorder, narcissism, of going to prison, okay? Again, I'm talking on the low end. Remember, these are all spectrums, right? Most people are scoring near the middle. It's a normal distribution. Fewer people at the extremes, okay? You probably do know some people who are high in agreeableness, who are always wanting to please others, who are always shying away from a fight and never want to get involved in any sort of confrontation or conflict. And you probably also know some people on the low end who are always looking for an argument, okay, who always want things their way, who are never self-sacrificing, okay, who are not adverse to conflict whatsoever. But you probably don't know a whole lot of people like one of those extremes, okay, because most people are somewhere near the average, okay. And then lastly is neuroticism, okay? So this is your propensity for negative emotion, how likely it is that you'll experience negative emotions. Like I say, they're correlated. If you're likely to be depressed, it increases the odds that you're also likely to be anxious, insecure, shy, volatile, irritable. Okay, all of these negative emotions are correlated. The only exception is disgust. Okay, sometimes disgust is classed as a negative emotion. It has no association with neuroticism. It's more associated with conscientiousness. Okay, the other negative emotions load onto neuroticism. So individuals who are high in neuroticism are more likely to have self-doubts, more likely to have lower self-esteem. They're more likely to think that people are judging them, even when they're not, that people will judge them as being worth less than how they would actually objectively measure them. So it predicts being self-conscious and shy. Right? Shyness is predicted by low extraversion and high neuroticism, right? It's not the same as introversion. Shyness is a fear of social judgment, okay? People who are high in shyness, okay, are fearful in social situations that other people are judging them, okay? So people who are high in neuroticism are sensitive to threats, particularly social threats. They're worried about not being liked or accepted by others. It negatively predicts happiness, negatively predicts mental health, and physical health as well. Okay, those who are higher in neuroticism, they're more likely to have a number of psychopathologies, from mood disorders, okay, to anxiety disorders, to phobias. Okay. Now, neuroticism is also, like agreeableness, one that has a sex difference associated with it. Okay, and that women score higher in neuroticism on average than men do. Okay. The difference, however, is that the sex difference in neuroticism doesn't exist until the onset of puberty. Okay. There is no difference in neuroticism or any indicator of neuroticism, like low self-esteem, anxiety, and so on, between boys and girls until they reach the age of puberty. Okay. It's only then at puberty that there then becomes a sex difference in neuroticism that then remains stable across the lifespan. Okay. Unlike agreeableness, okay, the sex difference in agreeableness emerges as early as we can measure agreeableness. Okay. Okay, what are your questions so far? Yeah, good. So the question was, is conscientiousness associated with OCD? And yes, extremely high conscientiousness does predict OCD. Um, we're going to talk about personality disorders and therapy later, but what you'll see is the big five has been used to predict a whole range of different disorders, and very successfully. Yeah. So the question was about changing your personality scores. Um, we're going to look at that too when we look at therapy, because quite often therapy is about trying to change some aspects of neuroticism. You know, maybe one wants to be less anxious or less depressed or less irritable, whatever it might be. Um, we do see good evidence in meta-analyses that through therapy, neuroticism decreases. Okay, so that would be a point for that. Um, in terms of changing the other four, there are age-related changes, okay? Meaning that as one gets older, they typically become more conscientious, they typically become more agreeable, they typically become more emotionally stable. You know, as you get older, particularly past young adulthood, you come to get better at dealing with your anxieties, your moods. You get better at staying focused on tasks and motivated. You become better at dealing with people, okay? So there are changes as one matures, okay? Openness is very, very stable, okay? Openness across the lifespan doesn't really seem to change. And aspects of extraversion, like sociability, also don't really seem to change, okay? I would argue that you could, by putting yourself in other situations and trying to, grow as a person, you can increase the range of situations you're comfortable in. You can increase your domain of competence, right? If you're highly extroverted, you can learn to be more comfortable on your own. If you're highly introverted, you can learn to be more comfortable in social groups and so on. But I would say your natural tendency doesn't much change, okay? Okay, so I told you that Costa and McCrae had a good scale for measuring the big five, okay, the NEO personality inventory revised, okay? What it does is it measures the big five, okay, which you can see here, but also 6 facets, okay? So there are 6 lower level facets to the big five, okay? Again, because the 5 dimensions themselves are so broad, right? That trying to capture any of them with one word is very, very difficult, okay? And so the idea behind this was sometimes you want to be more precise over what area of personality is associated with a particular behavior. And rather than just associating it with the broad big 5 level factor, okay, you might want to be more precise over what it's actually associated with. So you can read them yourself, but you can see openness to experience, for example. The lower level facets are fantasy, aesthetics, feelings, actions, ideals, values. Now, there is no empirical reason or theoretical reason for having these facets, okay? Costa and McCrae have said that they chose 6 because they had to draw the line somewhere, but there was no real theoretical reason, okay, for why there would be these particular or this particular number of facets for each of the 5 factors. There's also no empirical evidence or reason to have these facets because they don't appear in factor analysis, okay? You cannot find these 6 facets, okay, in factor analysis. They are just ways of trying to more precisely or on a lower level describe what openness is or what conscientiousness is or what extraversion is, okay? But they don't actually exist in factor analysis, okay? They also don't give us any better predictive power than the 5 factors on their own do, okay? So, for example, I told you before the openness or openness to experience, the factor, is associated with being liberal or left-leaning, okay? There are none of these facets that are more associated with being liberal than openness itself, okay? So actually, these facets very, very rarely help us be more precise, okay, in terms of what part of openness is actually associated with a behavior or an outcome, okay? So the questionnaire by Costa and McCrae, it has high internal consistency, it has high stability. The 5 factors, okay, have been shown to be valid in terms of predicting differences in outcomes and behaviors, okay? But there is very little evidence that the facets really provide much additional value, okay? What is becoming more prominent as a questionnaire to use for assessing the big 5 is the big 5 aspect scale, okay, which splits each of the 5 factors into 2 aspects, okay? Now, there is empirical evidence for this. The aspects appear in factor analysis, okay? So when you have a factor in factor analysis for openness, okay, you can see those that group together to form openness to experience, or those that form intellect, okay, as a sub-factor, okay, within openness. For conscientiousness, you can see the sub-factors of orderliness and industriousness. You can see these sub-clumps, okay, within the bigger clump, okay. They're apparent in factor analysis. There's also better predictive power, okay, in using the aspects, okay. So openness to experience, the aspect, the sub-factor, okay, that's highly associated with being liberal, okay. The intellect aspect is not, okay. So now we have greater precision, okay, on where in openness the part that's associated with being liberal. Now we have a better idea, okay, in what part it is, okay. I also told you openness is associated with intelligence, okay. There's mainly two types of intelligences, right? There's verbal intelligence in terms of IQ, and there's spatial intelligence, okay, your ability to rotate objects and so on, okay. The intellect aspect is associated with all forms of intelligence, okay. The openness to experience aspect is only associated with verbal IQ, okay, not with the other intelligences, okay. So by using the aspects, okay, we're getting greater precision, okay, on what parts of personality are related to these different outcomes or behaviors. There is also a neuropsychological argument to be made over the differentiation here, okay, between the aspects. So neuroticism, for example, okay, the two aspects here are withdrawal and volatility. The withdrawal aspect is capturing the characteristics to do with depression, anxiety, wanting to withdraw from situations. The volatility aspect is associated with the characteristics to do with irritability, okay, getting heated and moody and irritable, okay. There are clear biological systems associated with each of these, okay. With the withdrawal aspect is associated with the behavioral inhibition system, okay, a part of the brain, or a system within the brain rather, that keeps track on potential punishments within your environment so that you withdraw from those that will cause you to be punished, okay. The volatility aspect is more tied to the fight, flight, freeze system, okay, which is a separate system within the brain than the behavioral inhibition system, okay. So, like I say, it's becoming a more prominent model to use for the big five, okay, and I'm pleased that it seems to be only increasing, okay, in terms of the number of people within personality research that are using it, okay, because it gives us greater precision. There's empirical evidence for the aspects, and there's different biological systems associated with each of the aspects, okay. So, for openness, you have this aspect to do with openness to experience, the aspect involved in novelty seeking, seeking out diversity, wanting new experiences. You have the intellect aspect that's about being stimulated through intellectual activities, okay, like discussing philosophy, discussing history, discussing ideas, okay. For conscientiousness, you have orderliness, okay, about wanting things in their place. You have industriousness, about wanting to always be on the go and use your time productively. Extraversion, you have enthusiasm, okay, for how excited you are in social situations, how enthusiastic you are about getting rewards. Assertiveness, for how socially assertive you are in social situations. Agreeableness, polite, okay, for being inoffensive, compliant. Compassion, for being altruistic and sympathetic. And then neuroticism, which I've just discussed. Questions on the aspects? Okay. The paper, okay, by D. Young is the assigned reading, I believe, for next week, okay? But in the exam, it's not going to be enough to just know the big five. You also will have to know the aspects, the difference between the aspects. There may even be questions that describe a case, okay? So-and-so is someone who maybe is inoffensive and doesn't like to upset people, but also doesn't like to go out of their way to volunteer or have much empathy, whatever, okay? You will have to identify what aspect this person is high in, okay? So in this case, it would be politeness, okay? Out of politeness versus compassion. So you will have to be able to know the difference between the aspects in good detail, okay? Any questions? Yeah. Sorry, one more time. Yeah, so the question's about potential biological correlates with the different aspects in agreeableness. Yeah, politeness is quite clearly tied to testosterone levels, okay? And that those who are lower in baseline rates of testosterone score higher in politeness, okay? Compassion is a bit more complicated, but certain parts of the brain are larger in volume, okay, like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain that's heavily involved in empathy and taking on the perspective of others. Okay, so that's larger, okay, and those who are higher in compassion. So there are differences, yes. Any other questions? So, you know, one of the biggest strengths of the Big Five model, why it's used at all in personality research, is because we can actually predict differences in behaviors, differences in outcomes based upon one's Big Five scores in a personality questionnaire. I've given plenty of examples, okay? Those who are higher in conscientiousness, more likely to exercise and diet, and so on, okay? But we get even better predictions if we use not just one dimension score, but multiple dimension scores, okay? Which makes sense because people are made up of multiple personalities, okay, that all have different impacts on motivations and so on. So I told you that high conscientiousness predicts good grades. That's true. It's out of the 5 factors, the one that best predicts high grades, okay? But we get even better of our prediction if we also look at neuroticism, okay? Because those who are high in conscientiousness and also low in neuroticism, okay, on average do even better, okay, than those who are high in conscientiousness but highly neurotic, okay? Again, if you're high in conscientiousness, yes, you're more orderly, you're more industrious. But if you're low in neuroticism, you might be less likely to get test anxiety, okay? So that also could be contributing. I told you low conscientiousness predicts risky sexual behavior, okay? But in terms of predicting who's more likely to engage in risky sexual behaviors, we get even better of a prediction if instead of looking at just one trait, we look at multiple traits. And it turns out those who are high in extraversion, high in neuroticism, low in conscientiousness, low in agreeableness, those are the individuals most likely, okay? Alcohol consumption, yes, low conscientiousness predicts this, but we get even better of a prediction if we add in high extraversion as well. Low conscientiousness also predicts pathological gambling, but we also get even better of a prediction if we throw in high neuroticism. High agreeableness is the best predictor of volunteering out of the 5 factors. Again, it's associated with empathy and compassion and sympathy, okay? But if you're highly introverted, you might not really want to go and work in a soup kitchen surrounded by people or whatever else the situation might be. So you will get even better of a prediction if you're also high in extraversion as well as high in agreeableness. Okay. And other examples as well. Okay, leadership effectiveness predicted by high extraversion, high agreeableness, high conscientiousness, and low neuroticism. So in these cases on this slide, one of the factors themselves would give us a degree of predictability, okay, for this outcome, that we get even better of a prediction when we look at multiple dimension scores, okay, rather than just the one. In some cases, we only get a significant prediction if we look at multiple scores, okay, or multiple dimensions. So compliance during COVID guidelines, for example, predicting who would be likely to maintain social distance and wear a mask and so on, okay? None of the 5 factors on their own predicted this, okay? But when we looked at the combination of high conscientiousness and high neuroticism, then we got a prediction that those individuals would be the ones most likely to comply with the rules during COVID, okay? Only when we had both scores, okay? Not one of the factors on their own predicted this. So again, the 5 factors are very, very broad, right? Each of them are broad. Some researchers have even argued that we stop calling them openness and agreeableness and so on, and start just calling them factor 1, factor 2, factor 3, and so on, because the labels are misleading in some ways, because it's impossible to have one word that describes the entire factor, because the factors are so complicated and so comprehensive and so broad, okay? Each of these factors are not so much one thing, but a collection of many, many things that are closely tied together, okay? Before we finish up, okay, I just want to make sure one thing is absolutely clear, okay? This is not an open type and a conscientious type, an extroverted type, and so on, okay? Sometimes, I don't know, students sometimes are fixated on this idea of types, okay? And sometimes when I ask them if they prefer the Big 5 model or the 16 personalities Myers-Briggs, okay, sometimes they say the Myers-Briggs is better because it's 16 types, whereas the Big 5 is only 5 types. No, that's the wrong way of looking at it, okay? This is not 5 types, okay? It's 5 spectrums, okay? Everyone has a score on each of these 5 spectrums, okay? So most people are near the middle of each of these spectrums because it's a normal distribution, okay? And fewer people at the extremes, okay? But everyone has a score on how extroverted they are, okay? From high to low, how agreeable they are, how conscientious they are, how neurotic they are, and so on, okay? Okay, any questions before I finish for the day? Okay, then continuing on with the Big 5, I gave you an introduction last time into what it is, what each of the 5 factors are, and told you that there are assessments that are highly reliable, highly valid, and that they can predict differences in behaviors, differences in outcomes based upon people's scores on the Big 5 instruments. And hopefully you're beginning to realize just how comprehensive the Big 5 model is, right? It's not the case that it's 5 traits, it's 5 broad dimensions, and each of these dimensions is made up of many, many things that are closely tied together, okay? Rather than each just being one thing. I'll now go over some more evaluation, okay, of the Big 5 model. And of course, you'll form your own opinions on how useful, valid you think the Big 5 model is, okay? But one point to consider is the cross-cultural support that there is for the Big 5 model. A paper by McCrae in 2005 found evidence in 51 different countries. There's evidence from multiple more. Again, seeing that these 5 factors emerge through factor analysis when you ask people to describe themselves using adjectives, or you ask them to complete various personality inventories, okay, these 5 factors emerge. Only really with some exception, like some communities in the Amazon, in which it's really openness that doesn't clearly appear as a factor, okay? So in this particular study, okay, in this group, the characteristics that make up openness in most cases, like in studies done in the US, okay, those characteristics weren't correlated, okay, so they didn't make up a factor, okay? But we've already discussed that openness is the broadest of the 5 factors and the one that's hardest to see in factor analysis, because the characteristics are less correlated than the characteristics of the other 4 factors, okay? And it might be the case that in some places in the world, they're not as correlated as they are in others, okay? But even though there are the 5 factors, okay, these 5 factors that are made up of characteristics closely tied together in multiple countries, there are still differences in norms, okay, how high or low the average person is on each of these dimensions. So in Japan, for example, conscientiousness is the factor out of the 5 that's most highly valued, okay? It's highly valued to be disciplined and to be orderly and to have respect for the community and to be socially responsible and so on. In Eastern Asia, agreeableness is really the one that's thought to be most valued, particularly in certain countries there like India. Having compassion for others, having empathy, having altruism, compassion, these are the characteristics that are most valued. In Australia, it was found that extraversion and agreeableness was what was most desirable. The clearest difference is that in more collectivist societies, and I'm going to talk about cultural differences later in the course, but you probably have an idea on what collectivism versus individualism is already, right? In individualistic societies, it's all about the individual, you being the best that you can be, you making success for yourself, you making it on your own, right? The US is a highly individualistic society, as is most of the Western world, right? In a collectivist society, that's not the mindset. The mindset is what can you do for your community? What can you do for others? Okay, and that's more the case in, for example, some African countries, some Eastern Asian countries. In societies that are more collectivist, we see higher levels of agreeableness, okay, on average, than in individualistic countries. Whereas in individualistic countries, we see higher extraversion and in some places higher openness as well, okay? Again, not surprising, right? In a collectivist society, characteristics to do with agreeableness are highly valued, right? Like altruism and compassion and thinking about others before yourself, being self-sacrificing, which is really what agreeableness is. Whereas extraversion, openness might be more tied to individualistic experiences, right? Interestingly, there are also differences to the distributions based upon geography here within the US. Now, these are not as large differences, okay? I'm not talking about as large a difference as between the US and Eastern Asia, okay? But there are noticeable differences in norms, okay, between some states here in the US. So, for example, this part of the country is where people score highest in agreeableness, okay, where politeness especially is at its highest, okay, in comparison to other parts of the country like the West. Openness is at its highest in different parts across the country, but particular cities, really, it's surrounding. So Denver, Los Angeles, Miami, New York City, Portland, San Antonio, Seattle, San Francisco. Okay, these are where we see people scoring on average, the highest in openness in comparison to the rest of the country. There's a study by Florida that illustrates this pretty well. So, the more intense the red there is, the highest on average, okay, or where most people on the highest end of the distribution are found. Okay, so for extraversion, you can see it's kind of scattered around central, eastern US. Agreeableness is, like I said, the hotspot really is here in the southeast. There's also some states in the north that are also higher on average than other parts of the country. Neuroticism seems to be at its highest in kind of the northeast, particularly around kind of New York area. Conscientiousness, again, hotspot mainly seems to be here in the southeast again, but you can see it varies more across the country. And openness to experience, particularly around some Californian cities, around New York City, and some other cities like Miami, and Denver, Seattle, Portland, across the country. I'll quickly go through this. This is another study, other researchers, Renfro and colleagues, but you can see their findings are basically the exact same as Florida's results. Okay, you could, they completely mirror each other. So for agreeableness, okay, the top 10 states with the highest on average levels of agreeableness are in the darkest green. Again, you can see they're mainly in the southeast, a few up in the north. The lighter the green, okay, that's on average the lowest scorers in agreeableness. The same for openness. Again, the hotspots are New York City, California, Oregon, Washington State. The lighter the orange, the less on average they're scoring in openness. Neuroticism, again, the same as Florida. Okay, hotspots really around the northeast, the darker blue. Conscientiousness, again, mirrors Florida's results. Hotspots, kind of southeast again, but again, kind of scattered. Extraversion, again, mirrors Florida's results almost exactly. Again, these are not large differences, okay? They're not extreme differences, but they're noticeable, okay, in who on average is scoring highest in different places in the country. There are also then differences to the distribution based upon sex, okay, which I also mentioned last time. In general, women tend to score highest in agreeableness, neuroticism. These are the two biggest sex differences. It's half a standard deviation. I'm going to show you an illustration of what that means in comparison to, for example, the height difference on average between the sexes. Extraversion, also women score higher in on average. It's a much smaller difference. It's about 25% the size of the difference between the sexes in agreeableness. Okay, so it's much smaller. They also score higher on average in the orderliness aspect of conscientiousness. Men tend to score a little bit higher in the industriousness aspect, so those two kind of cancel each other out, and then there's no sex difference to speak of in terms of conscientiousness at the big five level. What I also mentioned last time that was surprising is that these differences are at their largest in the more wealthier egalitarian countries, okay? Those that have gone to greater effort, okay, to create more equality and balance between the sexes, okay, in terms of education access, job access, representation, okay. I'll show you a couple of examples of what this looks like. So in blue, okay, you have the average scores for male participants, and you can see how it might change based upon the age. I'm going to come back to this, okay, but I already kind of told you that people typically become more agreeable as they get older. They get better dealing with people. You can see that here, okay? You can see the significant difference between males and females really across the lifespan. In terms of neuroticism after 19, also, you can see the difference across the lifespan between the sexes, and also that people typically become less neurotic as they get older. They become better at dealing with their anxieties and so on. You can see a pretty marginal difference between the sexes on average in extraversion. In this case, also at certain points, you can see a fair difference in openness, but you can also see that there's less age-related differences to openness. It's pretty stable. Conscientiousness, again, people typically become more conscientious as they get older, and it's not really much of a significant difference. So let me illustrate what this looks like, okay? This is what the distribution difference is for height, okay? So the orange one here is the distribution, okay, of height for women. The blue one is the distribution of height for men. Okay, it's a large difference, and it's an observable difference. Okay, you all observe it every day, right? On average, men are taller than women are, right? Okay. You can see what this difference would look like for neuroticism and for agreeableness. Okay, it's about 1/3 of the size that the difference between the height difference is. Okay, it's 1/3 of the size. Okay, so it's a much, much smaller difference. Okay, again, it's not overwhelming. Okay, there are plenty of men who are neurotic, plenty of men who are agreeable, plenty of women who are not neurotic, plenty of women who are disagreeable. Okay, but what we're talking about is a reliable difference that's found on average, okay, across samples, across measurements, across cultures. Okay, I told you last time, you know, if I was to select a random man or random woman, give them a personality questionnaire, and to bet money on the women scoring higher in agreeableness, I would be right 60% of the time and wrong 40% of the time. Okay, it's not an overwhelming difference, but it's reliable. The extraversion difference is much, much smaller, right? It's 1/4 of the difference that neuroticism or agreeableness is. Okay, it's much, much smaller. Okay, but again, it's a small difference that we find from study to study. Okay, and that women are a little bit higher in extraversion. I also told you the difference in neuroticism, it doesn't exist really until the onset of puberty. Even indicators over neuroticism like low self-esteem. Okay, here you can see self-esteem measured in elementary school and middle school. This is a non-significant difference, okay, between the sexes. It's not then until high school that there becomes this significant difference between boys and girls in terms of self-esteem. The same is true for other indicators over neuroticism, okay, and neuroticism in general. And then the difference remains significantly different, okay, following this. That's not the same for agreeableness. The difference in agreeableness exists from as early as we can measure agreeableness, okay? And even before we can measure agreeableness, you know, aggression would be an indicator over low agreeableness. And we can see the sex difference in aggression from 18 months, okay? And that boys at this age are more overtly aggressive, biting more, hitting more, and so on, kicking more than girls. So I told you also the difference is larger in wealthier, more egalitarian countries. Okay, this is not what was expected. The first researchers were very much of the opinion that the sex differences in personality are socially constructed, and they were going to demonstrate this by showing that in more egalitarian countries that are more gender equal, the difference would be smaller. What they found surprised them. Okay, other researchers decided they must have done something wrong. We'll do our own research and we'll find the opposite, but they didn't. They found the same. Other researchers, again, found the same. finding the same. By this point, we have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of participants and multiple studies, okay, all with the same results, okay? Pretty much with all of these researchers looking to find the opposite of what they found, okay? So we can rank countries in the gender equality index, okay? Those at the highest end would be the most gender equal, the most egalitarian, those with the best representation of the sexes, the best access into education, into different jobs, and so on. So at the high end of this would be countries like Finland, Norway, Sweden. Kind of in the middle would be countries like New Zealand, UK, the US. At the very bottom would be countries like India, South Korea, Malaysia. And then we can also look at what the average difference is between the sexes in personality, particularly agreeableness and neuroticism, okay? And you can see that the difference on average gets larger, okay, in the countries that are more gender equal, okay, whereas it's smaller in the countries that are less gender equal. Again, not what was expected. What was expected was that these personality differences are socially constructed, okay, that they're a result of cultural influences. And we're going to talk about the nature-nurture arguments, okay, next week as we talk about biological explanations, okay. There are still some who would argue that, you know, even in the countries on the high end, there are still cultural norms, cultural factors that are contributing to differences in personality between the sexes, okay? But there are also evolutionary psychologists who have used this research to argue that there is a evolutionary basis, a biological reason, okay, for the personality difference on average between the sexes. The evolutionary argument would be simple, okay? Why are women more empathetic and compassionate? Because from an evolutionary perspective, they had to care for the offspring, right? The survival of the species depended upon them having high levels of empathy, high levels of compassion, okay? Whereas men were more likely to be hunters and dealing with competition, which required more aggression and less agreeableness, okay? Why would it be the case that women are higher in neuroticism and that the difference doesn't emerge until puberty? Again, the evolutionary perspective would be easy to explain. Women need to be more sensitive to threats because they're the ones caring for the offspring. So they have to be alert to any predators or any kind of threats, okay, that could be harmful to the offspring, okay? Again, necessary for the survival of the species. We also have biological evidence to make sense of the sex difference in personality, okay? Because higher levels of testosterone predict lower levels of politeness, which is an aspect of agreeableness. And on average, women are lower in baseline rates, of course, of testosterone. But also parts of the brain, like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, are larger in those who are more agreeable because they're involved in taking on the perspective of others and in empathy, okay? We know anyway from broader research that this part of the brain is thicker in women than it is in men, okay? So just looking at the biological correlates with agreeableness, that alone really is enough to make sense of why there would be a sex difference anyway in agreeableness, okay? And there's more that can be said on that, but like I say, we're going to deal with the nature-nurture argument next week, okay? So we can come back to that point then. Something else to consider is the stability of the Big Five, okay? This is part of the reliability of the instrument, okay? And that those tests we do of the Big Five, if we revisit you days later, weeks later, months later, years later, decades later, there's pretty good stability to the results, okay? Even though there are age-related trends or differences, okay? Openness is by far the most stable, okay? Along with certain parts of extraversion, like sociability, enthusiasm. Okay, all of these characteristics, those parts of extraversion and openness, are highly, highly stable. Okay, they really don't much change over the course of the lifespan. The other parts of extraversion, mainly social assertiveness, social dominance, taking control in social situations, that increases on average as one gets older. Agreeableness argues as one gets older. Conscientiousness increases on average as one gets older. Emotional stability, which is the reverse of neuroticism, okay, that on average increases as one gets older. Okay. Brent Roberts has done the best research on this, including a large meta-analysis in 2006, okay, looking at all of the existing research, okay, that's measured the big five scores in longitudinal studies, okay, seeing how people change as they get older. So here you can see social dominance on average increasing as one gets older, especially, around the age of 30. The other aspects of extraversion on the left, pretty stable. Agreeableness increasing across the lifespan. Conscientiousness, the same. Emotional stability, the reverse of neuroticism, increasing. Openness, highly, highly stable. There's a slight peak maybe in early 20s, and then pretty stable, maybe another kind of small peak once one gets to middle age, okay? But this is a minimal change, okay? Again, it makes sense. As you get older, you learn to deal with your negative emotions, your anxieties, your irritability better. You become better at dealing with people. You become better at staying focused on tasks and being orderly and being industrious. Whereas other parts of personality are maybe harder to change, like openness to experiences, okay? Your appreciation of novelty, your appreciation of social situations, right? Again, we're going to talk about this next week, but these are heavily associated with dopamine systems, right? And that those who are more extroverted have more dopamine receptors on average. Those who are higher in novelty seeking have different genes than those who are lower in novelty seeking, okay? The differences in dopamine receptor genes, okay? So those who are high in novelty seeking, they actually get a dopamine kick from experiencing something novel, which people who are low in novelty seeking don't, okay? Again, maybe part of why this part of personality might be harder to change. Now, Brent Roberts also has a theory called the social investment theory, which is that people change their personality, at least to a small degree, based upon their social roles, okay? So why is it you become more emotionally stable, conscientious, and agreeable as you get older? Brent Roberts argues it's mainly because of going into the workplace and having a job. And once you have a job, you need to deal with customers, you need to deal with colleagues, you need to deal with employees or managers. All of that will increase your skills in dealing with people, which will then make you more agreeable. You have to stick to schedules. You have to turn up on time if you want to keep your job. You have to meet deadlines and so on if you want to keep getting paid. So all of that makes you more conscientious. You, again, become better at staying focused on what it is that you're doing, and that might also help with managing worries, anxieties, and so on. And so it's the workplace that has a large influence on why these parts of personality increase. And as you're getting kind of guidance on what you should be doing for your job and you're getting feedback, all of that also will lower neuroticism. Neuroticism tends to spike in situations in which one doesn't know what they're meant to be doing, okay? But once one has some guidance or some feedback on their performance, then we could see a reason for a decrease in neuroticism, okay? Other roles and identities you take on also can cause a change in personality. Going into the military, for example, would be one sure way of increasing conscientiousness. okay? Because it's drilled into you to be highly disciplined and orderly, right? We also see that when one first becomes a parent, their neuroticism briefly increases, okay? It's, it goes back to normal, okay, after some time. But when one first becomes a parent, their neuroticism increases. Again, that's a time in which one doesn't really know exactly how they're meant to be behaving if it's their first child. It's not as though there's, a guidebook on exactly what you're meant to do. It comes with it a lot of worry, okay? And all of that can be contributing to higher anxiety, higher insecurity, higher neuroticism, okay? So our life experiences, the roles we take on, will certainly have an impact on our big five scores, okay? Just to put into perspective, these are, not dramatic changes I'm talking about, okay? I'm talking about a kind of slow, steady, small increase in some of these traits as one gets older, right? In terms of changing your personality more dramatically, that's an open question. I showed you a study a few weeks ago in which participants were looking to change their personality, but the results were open to interpretation in terms of how valid they were, right? Because it's not very clear that you can dramatically change your natural dispositions. Like I said last time, I would argue that you can become more comfortable in different situations. You can take on more skills. You can learn to be more sociable. You can learn to be more comfortable in your own space if you're highly extroverted and want to, be able to be comfortable spending time yourself and so on. But it's more like increasing your skill set, increasing your domain of competence, if you like, the range of situations in which you're comfortable in, okay? But the situations that you actually prefer, it's unlikely that those will change so dramatically. Okay, now another idea behind the big five was that these were five independent factors, okay? That openness had nothing to do with conscientiousness, and conscientiousness had nothing to do with agreeableness, okay? That they were five independent factors. In fact, this is not as true as the original researchers believed, okay? In fact, there is a small positive correlation between openness and extraversion, okay? And there is a small positive correlation between high agreeableness and high conscientiousness and emotional stability, the reverse of neuroticism, okay? In fact, it's easy to find, okay? In study after study after study, you can find a small correlation, okay, between openness and extraversion, and then a small correlation between emotional stability, conscientiousness, and agreeableness, okay? We're talking about a small correlation that's somewhere between 0.1 and 0.2 for each, okay? But it's, again, reliably found. And so that means they might not be as independent as the researchers originally believed. So Colin D. Young has come up with two higher levels of the hierarchy, if you like, which he calls meta traits, okay? So the meta traits above emotional stability, conscientiousness, and agreeableness, he calls stability, okay? To maintain stability, avoid disruption in emotional, social, and motivational domains, okay? And then he calls the other meta trait plasticity, okay? For high extraversion, high openness, okay? To explore and engage flexibly with novelty, okay? That might be the meta traits explaining the similarity or overlap to the extent that there is some between extraversion and openness, okay? As I'm going to talk about next week, okay, it makes some sense because what we find is that extraversion and openness are both associated with dopamine, okay, higher levels of dopamine. The other three traits are associated with serotonin, okay? High agreeableness, high conscientiousness, high emotional stability are all associated with higher levels of serotonin, okay? So there may be similar biological pathways, okay, governing extraversion and openness, and similar biological pathways governing emotional stability, conscientiousness, and agreeableness, okay? So to evaluate the big five, it's highly replicable, okay? Doesn't matter what the personality inventory is. It doesn't matter if it's designed to measure the big five or something else. It doesn't matter if it's simply adjectives from the dictionary or one-word items. We find the big five through factor analysis again and again, across cultures, across samples, across measurements, across time. There's biological and evolutionary support for the existence of the big five and why there would be variation in the big five. I'm going to talk more about that next week. There's the support of factor analysis. There's real life applications. That's really the best strength of the big five model. It would be useless if we couldn't predict actual future behaviors, actual outcomes that we can, okay, predict average differences in behaviors and outcomes using the big five inventory. They're generally stable. Yes, there are age-related differences like becoming more conscientious and agreeable and so on. But for the most part, people are pretty stable across the lifespan. And it can be measured at a very early age. We typically measure temperament instead of personality with children. But when we assess the big five in children, okay, we can still find its existence and there is still pretty high stability. And there are correlations between temperament traits and personality traits also. But the big five factors are not entirely independent. Okay, openness and extraversion have a small correlation. Conscientiousness, agreeableness, emotional stability have a small correlation. You could argue that there are missing traits. Again, this is an open question. It's subjective. Okay, spirituality is separate, certainly. Honesty, humility, you might argue should be a separate factor. You might argue that there could be others. It's not based upon any theory. Okay, no one theorized that there would be five factors or that these would be the five factors. There's not really any theoretical basis, okay, as to why these are the main areas or dimensions of personality. Openness is substantially weaker than the other four in terms of its existence in factor analysis. It's a much broader factor. The characteristics that make it up are much less tied together, okay, than the characteristics making up the other four. And to some extent, conscientiousness, particularly industriousness, is a bit of a mystery. And I told you already, we don't really have any neuropsychological model over why industriousness exists, over why one is industrious, or what it feels like psychologically to want to be industrious. So, I told you that traits are like sub-elements of personality, okay? But hopefully you've seen now that actually it's much broader than that. These traits are kind of like sub-personalities. They're frames of reference, okay? They have an impact on what you pay attention to, how you frame things, okay? They have an impact on your skill sets, the areas in which you feel competent in. If you're highly extroverted, you might want to capitalize on a social niche, okay? Because that's where you flourish, that's where you do well in social situations. If you're much lower in extroversion, you might feel very overwhelmed and exhausted by continuous social demand, okay? So you might be more comfortable in a job position, for example, that doesn't have this demand. It impacts what you value. If you're highly open, you value that which is diverse, unconventional, that which is novel. You maybe have a deep interest in something that's going to be a large part of what you dedicate your time to and what you like to converse about. If you're high in agreeableness, you value making other people feel good about themselves and dealing with the emotions of others, okay? Wanting to feel as though you're creating good harmony, okay, for those in your environment. They have an impact on your perception. If you're highly orderly, you're easily disgusted by mess, okay? If you're less orderly, you won't even really pay so much attention to that mess, okay? If you're highly compassionate, you're more in tune to unfairness or uncaring behavior that you feel as though is going to be harming someone. They are patterns of behavior. If you're highly extroverted, you like to socialize. If you're high in agreeableness, you like to display compassion and empathy, right? And they are motivations. Again, if you're highly extroverted, you're motivated to seek out social situations. If you're highly neurotic, you're motivated to avoid situations that would cause you anxiety or irritability. If you're high in agreeableness, you're motivated by those you care for, right? Okay, what are your questions about the Big Five? Yeah, Kimberly. Right. Okay, well, that would be a long time ago. Yeah, it's a bit similar. Someone asked a question on Tuesday, if, for example, in comparison to the 1960s, if the sex difference has got smaller in terms of what it used to be. I certainly don't know what it would be like in the 1800s. We only have research going back a few decades, but what we have tells us that the sex difference hasn't changed. Okay, in comparison to a few decades ago, the difference on average between the sexes in agreeableness within countries haven't changed. Okay, would there be a more substantial difference if we go back longer? Possibly. Many of you know that my main area of research in forensic psychology is eyewitness testimony, evaluating the eyewitness reliability of others. A trait that's measured in this field is suggestibility, which is the extent to which you'll take other people's accounts into your own narrative, okay, rather than stay true to yourself, even if you don't know the answer. Okay, suggestibility means if something's suggested to you, okay, you'll agree to that. You'll take that into account when you're producing your narrative. Okay, there was a reliable difference between the sexes in suggestibility until about the 1950s, 1960s. Okay, in eyewitness studies, there was a reliable difference for about 50 years in eyewitness research from about 1900 to about 1950. And then it completely disappeared, okay? And now for the last 50, 60 years, there has been no sex difference in suggestibility in eyewitness studies. My argument for that would likely be because in those early studies, it was male investigators who were doing the research and who were interviewing the participants. And yes, based upon differences between men and women, the women were probably more likely to agree to suggestions given to them by the male authority figures rather than the male participants. And once men and women became more equal, that was less likely to occur. I don't think there's any biological reason as to why men and women would be different in suggestibility, which is the difference, because there is a biological reason you could put forward as to why men and women might be different in terms of agreeableness or neuroticism. Okay, that would be the difference, though. Any other questions?